Welcome to Business Talk, Sister Talk. I'm Becca, and today's podcast episode is the start of a new series, The History of Marketing, Part 1. And this is something that I've been thinking about doing for a while. I mean, I've been thinking about doing a podcast series on marketing for a while, but the issue is that I've thought through it so many different ways because that is my background. I've been a lot in the weeds on marketing for a long time. And it's always kind of like made me hesitant to talk about. And I think there's like a multifaceted reason for that, because I can teach a lot of things about marketing, but I think it's important for people to have a full understanding of where marketing has been, what marketing is doing, and what potentially could be the future of marketing. Because there's so many iterations now of how fast things are moving and coming out with new ideas and ways to do stuff. It's always evolving, especially in the digital marketing space. Now, obviously, there are certain things that haven't changed, like labels on cans and things like that. That's a form of marketing. But I think it's important to get back to an understanding of the base level of where we've come with marketing and what's happened. And I'm not going to do obviously this all-inclusive thing from like the early days, but I'll put some things in perspective. So when I first started going to school for business and I wanted to make an emphasis in marketing, I remember the reason why I decided to do that was because in the 90s and the early 2000s, especially like the 90s, there was this huge move of people criticizing advertising because of the way it was shaping our thinking about body image and teenage girls' self-esteem and a rise in anorexia and all this stuff happening that they said, it's marketers. The marketers are the problem. They're so evil because they are making us feel bad about ourselves by creating something that is not attainable in a real human image with all of the things that were being shaped to make a human body look a certain way. And there's just no way that it was physically possible to be that marketed brand of what was considered beautiful. And at that time period, I thought, well, that's really affecting people. That's really affecting people. And when I was probably like 15, 16, I was reading a book about this guy who was writing about how he had gone across the United States talking to teenage girls. And he said, I want you to close your eyes and anonymously raise your pinky if you think that you are truly valued and special as a young lady. And in my mind, as I'm reading this book, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I would raise my pinky. And he said, that entire summer of traveling the whole United States, only 2 girls raised their pinky. And I was like, what? Why is this happening? Why is this affecting so many young ladies? How is it that this is a problem? And I realized in that moment, because I would just say I'm highly convicted by data, that there was something different about me in that moment. Why is it that I seriously was okay thinking that I was truly valued and special? Why did I have that self-confidence or self-esteem? What was that different about all of these people in the United States? And I had to know the answer to that. It just bothered me. And so when I started reading all of these books and things saying, well, the problem is marketing. Marketing is evil for society. Those people are snakes. They're selling snake oil. We should get rid of them. And I was like, well, I can't justify going out and picketing marketers. Like, I don't necessarily know if that's the problem. I want to understand it. And so that's why I decided to go to school to figure it out in college. And as I was doing that, what I realized is marketing is somebody saying, this is my business. Like having a business card, that's marketing. Putting a sign outside of your property is marketing. And those are the most base traditional forms, like back in the day when people couldn't read, you would put a shape of a boot on the side of your building and everyone knew that's where you went to go get shoes. And things like that are marketing. And so inherently, marketing itself is not bad because technically you need to do it in order to have a business if you want people to know what you're doing. Otherwise, how are you ever going to get customers? But there are some things about marketing that are really valuable to understand as they relate to psychology, because there are tools and tactics that marketers use all the time that can be beneficial for you as a business owner, but they can also create pause for you as a human being, thinking about the ethical and social responsibility of how you use these tools. And if you don't take pause, it can easily run away with you. And it's something that can get out of control quite quickly if you don't know how to control your own psychology. And I think that those are things that I've just really been thinking about of how to come up with this. So I'm going to start a little bit earlier in history, or later, I suppose, in history than that like shingle boot kind of thing, putting it out there and saying, hey, this is who I am as a business. I'm actually going to start in the early 1900s with somebody named David Ogilvy. And he's actually known as the father of marketing. And some interesting things about David Ogilvy: he was an excellent salesman. And he was born in 1911 and actually passed away in 1999, which is like 88 ripe years. I'm just going to say that. But anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit about him. So he has a UK background, British/Scottish. And when I was in school, I took quite a few marketing classes. And one of his books I read was about marketing. And very interesting guy. First of all, I think it doesn't really talk about it in the books or whatever, but like just you can tell by his personality, he was kind of that generation of business owners that they could demand the world of people, and you just had to like, if they said jump, you say how high and you do it, because otherwise you didn't have a job and you're fired. And that was like a whole generation of business owners. Like we have so much more stuff for like making people feel welcome and loved than there used to be. Like we're just gonna be honest. And so he was an interesting guy. And the reason why I think he was so influential in the history of what we see in marketing today is because he took some time to actually study at Gallup, which is a research institute that specifically focuses on data, like audience research, knowing your target market, understanding the consumer. All of that was part of what he really learned a lot about. And I think it was super influential to him. So, and the reason I say that is because that idea of knowing your target market really came from his influence on the advertising industry, of really digging deep into meticulous understanding of the persona who you were targeting. And with that, he just would be very confrontational with people about how to write copy, advertising copy, to people in an educational way. And I think one of my favorite quotes from him that he coined is, "The consumer is not a moron. She's your wife." And he was really good at basically telling you, like, you need to write to your target market and write intelligently. Don't disrespect them and say, you're stupid, you need to buy this. You need to educate them on why your product is the best so that they can make a good decision. Now, this is before like a lot of stuff like research papers, all the stuff at the time was put out by the major companies. And also like all of our TV shows, or even before TV, all of our radio programs were actually funded by advertisers. Or like Carnation Milk. Excellent example. Carnation Milk had a radio show and they owned it. It was their show because they knew that they could advertise their product by creating consumable content for people that they would listen to every night on their radio. Now, Ogilvy was a really interesting guy. Side note, during the war, he actually was up in Canada and he was part of a special division that worked on specifically psychological warfare, as well as like all these other crazy tactics for war and everything, because Canada and the UK were a thing connected, and the US was technically not allowed to be a part yet of the war. And so there was this secret operation going on up in Canada where they basically came up with all of these different tactics and stuff like that. And so we're talking like he knew a lot of data, but he also knew how to use that for psychological warfare to discredit different manufacturers or suppliers that were selling to Nazi Germany. And so he used a lot of his marketing tools to essentially create propaganda to destroy people's businesses. And like, this guy knew a lot of stuff. And I think he knew how to use it nefariously if you look at that aspect of how to use it in a wartime. But you have to understand that, like, with data, you can make a lot of decisions about how to go about something. And I think that that's a really great place to start and understanding. And then the other thing that I would say, super interesting about like advertising and all of this, is that when I was in my first accounting class, it was accounting 101. I remember sitting down and my professor looking at me and saying, "Oh yes, you're one of the ones that are the marketers. We hate you." And I was like, "What? What do you mean you hate us? What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you look at all of these financial things and we're paying all this money into marketing, but you can't prove your value. Why do we do marketing? Why is it important?" And I would say that, like, in a lot of the textbooks that I was reading and all this stuff, like Crisco, fantastic example, by the way, which originally was invented to replace lard as the primary animal fat used on people's food. Crisco actually was made out of cottonseed oil, and then it transitioned to, I think, sunflower oil later. But with that, they were somebody that advertised throughout the entire Great Depression. When people weren't really buying and stuff, they still were like fighting this battle with a couple other margarines and all this other stuff. And they said, during the Great Depression, we're still going to continue to keep our ad budget high. We're going to do billboards. We're going to do all this stuff. Well, when they came out of the Great Depression and consumer spending went back up, they actually came out on top as the number one brand for consumers to purchase and use because of their advertising. And stuff like that was how, in the past, you would see marketers say, well, you can see brand recognition is the way that we show that we're valuable. Or you can see the buying patterns because we came out on top. We were the ones that did that because we kept marketing. But most accountants and financial people don't see that as like a valuable metric, as like the thing that like proves you should get paid and keep your job. And a lot of times, like, I worked in agency world and all of that. What ends up happening is when, especially with small business owners, when they aren't seeing a return on investment right away, if they're just working on their brand recognition, they're like, well, this is not worth it. I'm firing you guys. And that happens a lot because they're not getting leads right away. But sometimes it's because their brand has to be established before the actual leads start coming in, because it's a trickle effect of like brand recognition, trust, like reputation building, and then you start getting referrals and you start getting all these additional leads through your marketing channels. Now, there's a whole lot of mechanics to that, and I'm not going to get into it. Like, you can watch many videos on ClickFunnels and whatever else. Totally fine. But what I think is interesting is that as technology advanced, marketers realized they could track everything through the internet. They could track how many people clicked on a website. They could track how many people watched your video. They could look at how many people bought something based on their consumer journey with partnerships that they created with other digital agencies. And all of a sudden, this flow of data just went crazy. And all of the things that Ogilvy was really passionate about, using high value data to really target your market, just began to explode with the introduction of the internet. Now, consumer research studies and Gallup polls and all of that, those things are still around. And I think that those are still valuable pieces of information to look at for quality of your product and consumer sentiment and how they feel with focus groups about your brand before going to spend a whole bunch of money on advertising. You save a lot of money, by the way. If you say, hey, what do you think of this name before you go register the name? Wish I would have done that with some of my brands, but anyways. But with that being said, there's value in those things. But with data, there soon became this desire for every marketer to track every single interaction, to the point that as a consumer, you didn't realize that your data was being snooped on. And once that started becoming more public, people were like, I don't want this. I want my privacy. I don't want you to know what I'm doing. But even before this, super interesting things were going on with data. with the introduction of credit cards, there was this whole new stream of ways to track consumer purchasing behavior. And credit cards, the reason why they make money when you don't pay it and you're like paying that high interest and everything, and they definitely get people there. But the other way that they actually make money, and this is in your contracts, is that they are selling your purchase data to people. And those people are using that purchase data to be able to curate better ads to send you of things you very well may buy. And some really great examples of this too, if you look, is Target. Target is notorious for tracking all of the data from their credit card and watching what people are purchasing and be able to do predictive intelligence to send you things that they think you would buy next. Now, here's an example of this, and this is like a legend in marketing, is basically they were able to figure out, based on your buying patterns, what kind of coupons to print for you for your next purchase. And there was mailers that would go out to people's houses. And this is like a lore story, but this guy got these coupons in the mail and he was furious because they were to his daughter in her name, her Target account. And there were coupons and a whole bunch of information, of flyers, whatever, on baby stuff. And prenatal care, whatever, all of these different coupons for diapers. And he's like, why are you guys sending my daughter this? Do not be encouraging her in this way. She's too young for that, blah, blah, blah. He was furious. And he tried to call Target and freak out on them about it. But the thing was that later he found out his daughter was pregnant. And he had no idea. But the thing was, this is why it was so important. And it was like this revolutionary moment for many marketers, is that, oh my goodness, we have the ability to predict based on people's buying patterns and know things about them before they themselves know it in their own lives. And the statistical likelihood of them buying these specific things in their cart means that they very well are going to have a baby. And that can be true of other predictive purchasing patterns. And Tesco in the UK actually is another brand that really digs into their loyalty program with how they print coupons, target customers, they set up these specific target market segments, and everybody gets customized mailers to their house based on their purchase pattern history that fall into one of their many buckets of people and what they're interested in. And then they try to predict what else if you liked this, you also would like this. Similarly to how YouTube tries to do that with your viewing history and says, hey, you searched for this previously, here it is, or here's something that related to that. So this predictive patterning is like that iteration before AI, but uses a lot of artificial intelligence for probability metrics to do that. And they're not the only industry that does this. I'm going to digress a little bit here, but this is going to be the gawk portion of this episode, okay? So when you have a mass amount of data, you can do predictive statistical modeling on what is a statistically significant correlation. If this, is it correlated to that? And you start looking at patterns of, what we just talked about, if this, is it related to this? And you try to identify correlations in the data based on history. Now, when I was in college, I was in a data class, and I think it was data analytics or something, and I felt a little bit, quite frankly, out of my depth. But we had a guy come in and talk, and I am notorious for asking questions where everyone's like, I can't believe you asked that. But I did. I said, do you ever see any correlations within your data that are significant to you? Or do you find things out that would be interesting? And this guy who came in to talk, he actually worked for a company that was in the medical industry. And I'm not going to say the name, but basically what they do is they collect all of this data and house it for all of these major health organizations that have people go into the doctor or whatever, and it's all taken down in the system. When the doctor asks you, what's your blood pressure? Or how much do you weigh? And have you been coughing recently? All this stuff, it's going into the system. And this system is run by one company, even though that they service many major healthcare networks. And I'm not saying all companies have the same one, but this is a pretty big one. And what's interesting about it is he actually told this story of, actually, yes, this story actually haunts me still today. And I was like, okay, what is he about to share, you know? And he talked about how in his department, one of the things that they found a correlation with, that they were able to do some predictive modeling on, was the fact that people who listed in their interests on their chart that they were gardeners also were dying like incredibly fast. And they said, what is this? And they started digging into it. Why are these people dying? And then they realized that in the autopsies, as they were looking at the data, there was something about an infection in their nose. And they're like, well, what is that? And so they started like notifying researchers, and people started getting involved, and they started looking into it. And then what they realized was that there was a fungus in the soil that was being released into the air. And gardeners were more likely to breathe it in and cause this infection in their nasal passages that actually ended up getting into their brain and causing them to die. And once they figured out this correlation, they were able to communicate that as like a, hey, if this, then this, and started changing some of their software to ask additional questions to look at whether or not people would potentially have this fungus. And I don't necessarily know why this person was saying that this story haunts them, but I'm willing to bet it's because if you found that kind of correlation and knew that there was something that was causing people to die, and you had that information available to you, it would burden you to the point that you would want somebody else to know and do something about it as soon as possible, because you could potentially save more lives. And that is heavy. And like I said, I'm not really sure entirely, but that's what I would feel. If I had that in my hand, I would want that to be something that somebody knew as soon as I could get it to them. And I think that that's a good part of data, but I also think there are some cons, like we've talked about, like the privacy aspect and all of that. And there's probably a lot more that I haven't gotten to yet, but I think that these are really good places to just get into the weeds on when it comes to the history of marketing, because I think it's good to know before you start getting into the place of using it for yourself, to understand what all is involved and where we've come from, so that the tool that you have in front of you isn't taking advantage of you as you're using it to your advantage. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, you should give it a review on wherever you're listening, and tune in next week because we are going to be talking about the same topic and I get really excited about history. So this is going to be fun.